Okay, thank you, Janice, and thank you, Terry, and to the Centre of Excellence for the invitation to come along and talk today. I'm Gretta Pecl. Nobody ever gets that right, and I don't mind, so no problem there. And I am going to talk about the potential for using natural laboratories for climate change in the context of adaptation. Before I do, there's a number of collaborators that I'd like to acknowledge. Some of those are here today. I think Stuart Frusher, Alastair Hobday, Reg was here yesterday, I haven't seen him today, probably here today as well. You'll notice that a number of those collaborators are from the Centre for Marine Socioecology. That's a new centre here at Hobart, started this year, a collaborative centre with a number of institutions behind it, and I'd really encourage you to jump on the website and have a look at that exciting development. In terms of climate change, we're obviously very aware that the magnitude of temperature change, for example, that we've had in the last few decades is comparable in magnitude to some of the changes that we've had in the last 65 million years, but it's an order of magnitude greater in terms of how rapid it is. Humanity really is a geological force at the planetary scale, and that's making the imperative for adaptation really quite urgent. Climate change really is a large-scale perturbation experiment on the biophysical properties of our planet, and I think we'd all agree that in general it's a pretty crappy experiment. In particular, it's very badly designed. We don't have a control, we don't have replicates, but what we do have is regional variation in the magnitude and speed of climate change drivers, and the example that I've shown there is sea surface temperature. So our idea was, how can we capitalise on this regional variation in the context of natural laboratories for climate change? And it started because here in Tasmania off our east coast, as you're probably all aware, we're in a hotspot for rate of warming, and consequently noticed a lot of biological changes in the marine environment relatively early on. Some of those there, the poleward expansion of sea urchins, a new octopus species that hadn't been recorded in Tasmania prior to a decade ago and is now 13% of a fishery on the north coast there. Changes in the distribution of intertidal species, fish species, and seaweeds as well. So a lot of physical and biological change off the east coast. And if we take a look at a food web diagram, a typical food web horrendogram, and we put a circle around each one of those components where we've had changes detected that are consistent with what we'd expect with climate change, you can see that that's throughout the entire food web except that very top layer there, and I'd suggest that's probably because we haven't looked there yet. But those changes in the physical and biological environment really piqued our interest in trying to network with other regions that were facing similar challenges to us, that being the high rate of temperature change. So we started developing a global network of marine hotspots, a research network, and have run a series of international workshops and publications emerging from that, networking across all of these regions, with the idea that these were prime locations for assessing impacts and developing and evaluating adaptation options. And there's already a number of large-scale projects under that banner looking at, for example, the Belmont project there is looking at food security and marine climate change in 5 of the Southern Hemisphere hotspots, so Brazil, Madagascar, India, who have I forgotten? And Southeast Australia, so a number of regions there, all networking and collaborating together around that idea of adaptation. So our rationale for networking across these hotspots was that attribution to the impacts of climate change might be possible earlier in these regions that have got a high rate of key drivers. And we were also envisaging that if these regions are experiencing impacts earlier, they might also be at the forefront of developing and testing and evaluating adaptation options, and that was our key interest. I want to be really clear that we're not suggesting that temperature is the only factor that's important or that this concept would only apply to temperature. It could equally apply to areas that are high rates of acidification, for example. And of course, whatever approach you take, you need to be looking at multiple stresses and drivers, as have been highlighted by a number of talks so far. So when we got these researchers from these regions together, there's 24 hotspots as we've defined them, and obviously there'd be a number of ways of defining those as well. So we got a whole lot of researchers from these regions together via different international forums. One thing that was immediately evident was that there was an awful lot of information on climate change but unpublished or in the grey literature, and I'm sure that's the case for other countries as well. Most of those regions had in situ records verifying that they were having a high rate of temperature change, because our analyses was using sea surface temperature, not in situ values. Most of those regions had experienced quite significant rain shifts in a variety of species. They had significant deoxygenation zones and had already seen large-scale changes in the distribution of their fisheries and associated fleet movements. So it really was evident that those impacts were at the high end, even though a lot of that wasn't in the published literature. But when we did look at one of the global databases for marine impacts, and that was the NC's Marine Climate Impacts Database, that was this paper with Elvira Polachanska was based on. When we looked at the data that she'd used in that original analyses, very few of those observations actually fell within hotspot areas, but where they did, the consistency of response was slightly higher in those hotspot regions compared to other places around the world. So we've got hotspot regions with large biological and physical changes, but what's their potential to be used as natural laboratories? So we were interested in developing a quantitative index to assess the capacity to harness information from those regions, but more importantly, to disseminate and distribute insights and lessons learned from those places to other parts of the world. So obviously a concept very similar to the vulnerability index developed by Eddie Allison and the Ocean Health Index, very, very similar to that. So we set about developing a marine adaptation index, or that's what we've called it for the time being, and we were interested in particular in 4 capacities. What was the potential for these regions to detect ecological or biological change in the first place? Once they detected changes, what capacity did they have to manage or adapt to these responses? What evidence was there that they had ability to learn from change and then take further actions? And most importantly, the ability to communicate. So what capacity do these countries have for sharing advances with the broader community? So we've generated each of these capacities using metrics from across social, economic and governance domains, and an ecological one obviously for the capacity to detect. And we've extracted these metrics at the level of the EEZ. So a hotspot might have a number of contributing countries to it, but we can't derive these metrics for a hotspot per se. So we're looking at that at the level of the EEZs that are contributing to those hotspots. In developing the metrics, we've really concentrated on several types of information. So we wanted information on the broader social, economic and governance context of particular countries. So, GDP, levels of conflict, all sorts of different factors that might influence the broader governance context of countries. We looked at metrics specific to research capacity, so investment in R&D, changes in investment in R&D, was that increasing or decreasing? And then metrics that were specific to fisheries or marine management using information available in a number of other databases. So there's 25 metrics altogether. Obviously, there's always a lot of contention around developing these kinds of indices, pros and cons, as discussions around those, as there should be. And there's a lot of difficult choices to make around what metrics do you select, how do you standardise them, do you weight them, how do you aggregate these values? And we're still exploring a lot of those questions in the data that we have. But at the moment, it's an additive model that we've used to derive the composite indices. I'm not going to go through all of the metrics that go into the index, but just looking at the one for detect. So metrics that influence a country's capacity to detect biological change in the marine environment. We've obviously looked at the number of biological observations that are available in each of those areas, the density of the human population within 100 k's of the coast, and the idea there being that a greater density influences the likelihood that people will be exposed to changes in the marine environment. R&D expenditure as a proportion of gross domestic product, government effectiveness, so that would indicate the capacity to monitor and notice change, and then the fisheries-specific measure there, the monitoring control of fisheries. So more intensive monitoring of fisheries would increase the potential for change to be detected. I won't go into the other components of the other metrics, but just to mention briefly some metrics that went into the capacity for communication. We went in and looked at what's the percentage of publications coming from each country that has international co-authors on it. So the idea there was that greater international collaboration increases the distribution and dissemination of information to other places. It's the export metric, if you like. We also looked at attendance at key marine fisheries and climate change forums. So that was one of the metrics that we gathered original data for ourselves. So we contacted the hosts of World Fisheries Congresses, Marine Conservation Conferences and Marine Climate Change Conferences and looked at where were the attendees coming from for each of those forums. A quick look at the Marine Adaptation Index and what it looks like at the moment. If I get the right pointer, yep. You'll see that, so we've got each of the capacities plotted separately there, and you'll notice that there are some countries that seem to have a very low capacity as we've measured it for detect, act, learn and communicate, and that there are some regions with a much higher potential for being used as natural laboratories, if you like. There's obviously a lot of information that we could extract from this type of diagram, but quickly, one of the things that jumped out to me were things like countries like Taiwan, where they seem to have a fairly reasonable capacity to detect, act and learn, but a very poor capacity as we've measured it in terms of communication. So is that a country, for example, where we should be trying to communicate more extensively with marine researchers from that environment so that we can harness some of the lessons learned from their hotspot? The next phase that we went through was trying to identify a metric that gave us an indication of what was the extent of adaptation planning in the marine environment that were underway in those particular regions. So we've trawled through a whole lot of documents in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, a number of database websites that amalgamate climate change policy documents, and we've sent emails to individual researchers in all those countries trying to identify what adaptation plans for marine biodiversity or fisheries there are. So we're trying to identify what's the activity in that adaptation space in those countries. We have all those documents now, and we've actually gone through and identified, was there absolutely no mention of adaptation or fisheries in any of those documents, through to, on the bottom there, were there specific sectoral plans that mentioned specific actions that were recommended, planned or undertaken for fisheries or marine biodiversity. And we finished getting that data on Monday at about 5 o'clock, and we're now going through assessing what components of that Marine Adaptation Index might be associated with an increased degree of adaptation planning. One thing I would like to acknowledge there is that this is, I think we've got a reasonable metric of adaptation planning from a government perspective. So what's the government's interest, commitment to adaptation? But there's also a lot of adaptation actions taking place on the ground in places, particularly in developed countries, community-based adaptation with NGOs, and we don't yet have a metric to harness that information. So this really is just that government high-level indication of adaptation planning. What is evident is that some countries will have a greater capacity to act as natural laboratories than other regions. Some regions obviously will be very prepared to detect, act, learn and then communicate those lessons to the rest of the world. A lot of the countries had great differences in their capacities. So Taiwan, for example, reasonable capacity to detect, act and learn. By our measure, a very low capacity to communicate that information to the rest of the world. So how could we engage better with those types of regions? Regions that had a very high capacity for detect, they might be places where we would go in preferentially and try and validate our projection models. If they're at a high rate of change and they've got a high capacity for detecting change, they could be very productive places to be looking at our projection models. And obviously countries with low overall capacity might require assistance to minimise impacts. So moving into a no-analogue future and maximising our potential to address some of those unavoidable impacts will depend on our capacity to learn and communicate quickly with each other. It's not just a case of publishing our literature in high-end journals, for example. There's a lot of other things that could go into our capacity for communication. We have a lot of calls for multi-century policy around emissions, for example, and a lot of global negotiations around funding for adaptation, but we're suggesting that we need to have a longer-term strategy for detecting, acting, learning and communicating possible advances around adaptation, and a part of that could be better capitalisation of our natural laboratories for climate change. So we justifiably have a lot of discussion and debate around framing and designing experiments in your typical laboratories, and we're suggesting that we should be doing the same in terms of maximising and harnessing information that we can get from our natural laboratories as well. Thank you very much.